Hello and welcome to An Evening with AphroChic, an AphroChic TV original series where we host intimate conversations with authors, filmmakers, and creatives from across the African diaspora.
The new AphroChic.com is a virtual home for the African diaspora, a place of safety and recognition in a world that offers too few, whether on or offline. An Evening With is our salon space where we have the conversations that celebrate, uplift, and inspire our community.
Tonight, we are very excited to be speaking with Kleaver Cruz, author of the Black Joy Project, an extension of their real-world initiative of the same name. An educator and activist, in their book, Cruz shines a light on Black joy as a revolutionary act and a source of healing and regeneration for Black people of all backgrounds and identities.
International in scale and fist raising in prose, the Black Joy Project does what no other book has ever done in words and art, putting joy on the same track as protest and resistance. Tonight, we'll discuss the inspiration for this groundbreaking book, Ancestral Joy, and how Black joy is a necessary revolutionary act.
Welcome, Kleaver.
Hey.
We are so glad we've been waiting for this, conversation. It's so very important. And so I actually just kind of want to jump in and just start, with our present moment, with the election behind us and so many of us devastated by the results. Where can we find joy right now? And what can it do for us in this moment? Yep. Oop.
My bad, y'all.
No
Millennial mistakes. I put them here. Hey, y'all. I'm gonna introduce myself again. Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here. And to your question, what comes to mind is I have felt a type of resolve in the last couple of weeks, in the sense of um, things are more clear than they ever have been in terms of where the chips landed, so to speak. And for me, I see that as opportunity to lean in. That this is opportunity for us to lean into the things that we've inherited, the technologies, the wisdoms, and to create whatever needs to come next. And I don't say that in the ideal sense. I mean that in the sense of giving each other the room, though, to grieve. Like, that's like, you use the word devastating. That's a particular word. So for us to be allowed to be upset and angry and whatever the feelings are, from understanding that yes, this is the reality and it's a harsh one that we have to be in. Just because I'm saying I have resolve doesn't mean that it's roses. But I think the joy is no. I believe part of the joy is I really have a belief and faith that we can. It's not even about surpassing this, but this is the opportunity to truly create and contribute to what it is that we need to exist in the world, because we can't wait for everybody else to agree with us to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. And I think it was so much what you said about the reality of it. That's it's such an important point that we skip over sometimes. There's the need and the ability to face a reality. That there is always the urge to sit there and go, well, I don't believe this is happening. You hear that all the
Right.
time, people, and it's like, well, but it is happening, and you're going to have to come to terms with it. You have to come to grips with it. And there's so many realities that we face right now that we're just not doing that with,
Yeah.
on so many different levels.
Yeah.
And so understanding joy and the way that you put it and the way that you explain it in this book, and really how it becomes a way to help you address those realities that you're not really ready for, that you don't want to grapple with yet, but you have to go through. And so, just as we kind of get started in talking about it, I'm just interested. So, how do you define Black joy broadly? So if you were to, and because we talk about it a lot of times in terms of what it does, but if you
Yeah.
were to describe it in terms of what it is, what would you say?
It changes all the time. It really does. I would say that this week it was spending time with my grandma. I just got to go back to New York, and it was really nice to spend time with her and like listen to her story and her stories. You know, just care for her, to share that love with her. That's been bringing me a lot of joy, and really, like I was telling somebody earlier, is being with her and seeing her in this phase of her life has been showing me ageism, how systems of health and things don't really care for elderly people or people who are perceived as elder. And that in this weird way, well, not weird, we understand why these things operate that way. That something about when you assume an older person knows less, which never made sense to me, but is less knowledgeable, so to speak. What I'm getting to is that has really been bringing me joy of somebody constantly reminding me of what the sharpness of a mind is, even when sometimes the body may not be able to reflect that strength. And that's important because it's not just her. There's tons of people like that, that they may not be able to run or like move in a certain way, but they have a lot to contribute. And they may get discounted because of something like a physical ability or that type of thing. That yeah, it's just those sweet little reminders, those types of things. Yeah, that I think the small moments is what I've been holding on to lately
Yeah.
because we know what the big picture is giving right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the small moments really do, mean so very much. And like you said, spending that time with your grandmother, just having those moments of togetherness, and how important that is. I definitely want to talk more, about your joy and looking back as I know this is a project that you've been doing for quite a while.
Yes.
Where are some of the places or what are some of the moments that either demonstrated or taught you how to find joy, how to tap into it?
Mm, I mean, so many. I really have to say so many. The very first one that just came to mind was I think it was the first or second year that we did um, uh, a photo booth at Afropunk in Brooklyn. It was like in 2016, I want to say. And there was a really long line. It was interesting because nobody knew what the Black Joy Project was, but part of it is like free amazing portraits because we had set up this like I went to a thrift store and found a gold frame that's still on my wall over there, and we put like African fabric that I had found whatever the cheapest roll I could get, and we turned that into like a little backdrop. And my friend, shout out to Dominique Sinda Uganza, he took portraits all day for like 12 hours for 2 days of like hundreds of people.
Mm,
But there's one person I remember in particular because she was deaf. And
mm,
I remember at that moment of like, she obviously was going to get her picture taken, all that. The moment was amazing, but it was more of the pause of if I stick to only making this about images, for example, then perhaps like a black person with vision impairment or who is blind or that type of thing may not be able to access something that I'm trying to share in a certain way. So it really pushed me to think about how can the Black Joy Project exist in even more ways so that it can be a photo thing in one way, but then that's part of why yeah, and that just led to other moments to answer your question of like
yeah.
we made it into a radio show and to a bunch of other different things to try to create as many different windows into this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And it's interesting because I think a lot of times people think like, oh, joy is just like you're happy and that's just sort of it. But it sounds like what you're saying is, there's community
Yeah.
and there was also inclusivity and thinking about the needs of others. Um,
Yes.
and I do think that that is something that can help all of us as we're all trying to sort of figure out how do we move forward and what does all of this mean and what is our world, going back to those key things. How can I be there not just for me but for someone else? How can I do community building? That was one of the things that was really important for us with an evening with having this series, is because I live with disabilities from COVID. I've been disabled for 4 years, and going out and going to places is super hard. Like it's like we got to pack stuff. We have air purifier, masks, the whole situation.
Because the world's acting like it ended.
Yeah.
Oh, like
Yeah.
it's over.
Like it's
Like
over. Like it never happened.
no, it is not
Like,
over. Like it is
girls, we are
not
in
over
it.
at all.
Yeah.
And so for us it was like, well, how can we have nights that we still like to have talk to people and still have something that's
Yeah.
engaging, but that is not unsafe.
Yes.
And so that just doing this to me is a real form of joy and of being having dialogue and being able to still communicate and connect with others and creating space where people can connect with others virtually. Is we're understanding like that is a revolutionary act in
I think
itself.
so too. And what's coming to mind is also when I'm engaging with these things, I really am sincerely considering blackness as expansively as possible, you know? And that's partly for me being a black, non-binary, queer person, yada yada, all the other intersections. That to me increasingly feels like a blessing because that offers me the opportunity to question who is and is not in that space. Because often I've seen, at least in my coming up of things, is that when we're saying black folks, we're not always considering everybody, and that the types of black people that I've been closest to get excluded from these types of conversations or spaces. That we're not talking about black trans women, we're not talking about non-binary black people, we're not talking about black lesbians, queer folks, and so on. That's part of the motivation as well too. With in those joyful moments, is also knowing that it got to be as expansive as possible. 'Cause I think that is one of the best examples of black joy is, or the one that I talk about in the book. That if I were to boil it all down, is literally just us allowing to be, without interruption, with no harm, and without just letting us be. That's it.
Yeah.
That's what black joy ultimately means. And really, we're talking about freedom. That's liberation to just be.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's interesting because we do a lot of sort of like tracing, in these conversations, and we talk to people a lot about sort of like their first experience of things, where they first engaged with their creativity, the first time they picked up the instrument that they play, what have you. But it's really interesting that the Black Joy Project, on to a certain extent, is an attempt at crystallizing the experience of this thing that we all have and that we know and that we carry and that we access at particular times. But when you sit down and you try to think about, where did I learn joy,
Mm,
or where did I get that? Like you can remember the first time somebody told you could sing, or you remember the first time you decided to get on stage and act or something like that. But to think back and go, okay, but I know this thing and I recognize it and I feel it and I see that other people feel it and see it and recognize it too. But where did I actually get it from? Like, how is that passed on? Like, how does that process of picking it up? And so as you've gone through and really chronicling and exploring the concept, um, do you have any thoughts on how it makes that travel from one generation to the next, from one person to the next? Where are we bringing this from?
I really, really appreciate the way you just framed that because it's the answer to your question. That to me, what that signals, what I'm hearing when you're describing that, is the innateness of Black joy. That it's
Yes.
what I talk about, and not just me. Like that's an inherited wisdom of is one of those things that was not given to us. You know, like that given in the sense of like literally handed, that's inherited, so to speak. Like that comes with being the joy part. Because I think, joy is a human thing, of course, but black joy is something that is particular because we added that word to it. And in that sense, what I was hearing when you're saying, I was thinking about how not one person that I've spoken to or asked what does black joy mean to you had they never heard or understood that. You know what I mean? Maybe not in those terms. Like maybe they didn't call it black joy or that type of thing. But I have not met a black person that's like, joy, what are you talking
Like,
about?
what?
Yeah. So to me, that signals the innateness. That means like that's something that we have already. And the power is to pull that out, the consciousness of it, because it's already happening. That, yeah, is that answering your question?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely,
Yes.
and it kind of brings up another one because you mentioned that in the book that it was in 2015 when this project, when the whole idea and the concept began for you, and you
Sure.
found yourself needing to engage with your own joy in these
Right.
radical ways that led to where we are now. What can you tell us, or can you give us a little bit of insight into that moment in your life and what led to
Sure.
this turn to joy?
Yeah, so I was living a very hectic life of sorts. And that morning, I woke up feeling terrible, like every sense of the word. Um, and yeah, it was just having this very meditative moment of trying to make sense of what is going on because I'm the type of person I'm the motivator, now we're in touch with our feelings, we process them. But at the time, it was very like pushed through, like, we're gonna go hard kind of thing because we have
Yep,
people to show up
grind.
for and that type of thing. And I was a regional director of a nonprofit, so I also was literally in charge of other people. So my mind was very much in that space of I got to motivate the team, the crew, the group, because those people are motivating young people in New York City. Um, that yeah, so I woke up and I didn't feel any of that. Essentially, like it was very simply put, I was very fucked up. I did not feel great, and that led to this very like spiritual moment where I saw the words black and joy. It like floated, and then I was like, all right. And back when Facebook was really a thing, it still is, no shade. Um, love you, Facebook viewers. And I posted this picture of my mom that I had remembered, and this was also like late November, so about 9 years ago, this
Mm.
time, which is really interesting. And today's also 11-month birthday of the book.
All
Oh,
right, all
happy
right.
birthday.
Happy birthday.
Yay. So yeah, it was literally like around this time in 2015 that a little bit later, because this was after Turkey Day, that yeah, so I had remembered this picture. This was the first holidays without my uncle who had passed away earlier in the year. We were just I personally was in this grief plus all the responsibilities and things I had going on, that putting that picture on the internet was just this stream of consciousness of like, because this is also in time a couple of months after Sandra Bland was found dead in her cell, and like a year and change after Mike Brown had been killed in St. Louis, and all the things that happened in between and before, that I was just having this sense of like it was important for us to be present to that, because remember that at that time that was like a big thing that we were just being like all the time watching people were reposting these videos.
Yeah.
Um, Now it's normal, which is really wild, but back then it really wasn't. Um, it was becoming, and so my feeling was, we can also add. It wasn't to ignore that, but like we also can have space for joy. Something felt like if I'm going to make it, because right now the way I'm feeling, I'm not going to make it, and so if I'm going to make it, I'm gonna have to have my work be through joy, um, without it being an escape from these other things. It's just that my compass is gonna have to be through joy because the way that I'm feeling right now is I can't keep going down this other way type thing.
Mm.
And so that, yeah, and then it went on from there.
Yeah. And for 9 years, like you said, 9 years ago,
Yeah.
and and I'm curious because you do so many things. You are, an activist. You're an author. What did the project start out as, and how has it grown or bloomed in different ways in that period?
It was nothing but I want to feel better. That's how it started. Me and my little iPhone, whatever number that was. And yeah, and honestly, it wasn't even my phone. It wasn't taking pictures yet. It was going back and scrolling to have ones I already had of like my cousin and, just the people immediately around me. Because the goal was I'm going to do this for the last month of 2015, so in December. And hopefully I'll feel better by the end of that month. And it was partly inspired by my friend Akuya Soadwa, who she led these things called 30-day self-love challenges. And so I was in the middle of one and I'm like, my Aquarius mind is like, I'm not doing it right. Instead of feeling it, I was thinking about it, mess. So I was like, I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this right. So maybe I can shift a little bit of this towards just wanting to feel better because I can't describe really in words the low I felt that morning. But that the Black Joy Project really came from that and not some like sunshiny morning of let's spread the joy. It really came from like, I wish I would have done anything but wake up this morning type of feeling. That, yeah, and so it was like, okay, but I want to live, I want to keep going. So maybe if I do this for a month. And so I started doing that. And then sometimes I would take pictures of my friends and stuff if we're out, and would describe like a little in a few words what was in the picture. And after a couple of weeks, people started reaching out to me of like, hey, I had a terrible nightmare, and scrolling a little bit helped me enough to calm down to go to sleep. Or a friend of mine had moved to South Carolina to do organizing around that student in 2015 that had been slammed in her desk in her high school,
Oh.
in Columbia, South Carolina. And so she had reached out to me of like, hey, this is helping me, you know, just have a little motivation as I'm adjusting and figuring out what organizing is going to look like here.
Mm.
Um, Shout out to every black girl in South Carolina. And so, yeah, and so then that evolved. When that happened, I was like, okay, maybe this is a little bit more than me wanting to feel better. And so I moved it from Facebook to Instagram. And that's when I gave it a name, the Black Joy Project. And really, from that, it felt like we locked in. And it's been a ride since that moment of having the opportunity to travel to a bunch of different places in various capacities, whether it was like I got to do a residency in South Africa in 2016, and I got to interview people in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, just asking them about like what did Black Joy look like in that context, or being in representing the U.S. at a conference in Brazil in Sao Paulo to address issues of prejudice, incarceration, and genocide is the term that Afro-Brazilians are using for the systemic murder and treatment and violences against Black people in Brazil. And that
Yes.
was incredibly eye-opening because my responsibility was to illustrate a little bit about what was happening in the U.S. at that time with Black folks. And the context, of course, is in the biggest population of Black people in the Western Hemisphere, which is in Brazil. And the irony of it being in the biggest university in Latin America, and it had like this many Black people in it.
Mm. Mm.
And so it was partly like this space of reclamation of resistance. And so it was interesting to talk about Black joy in that context. And then to have it, that was the first time it wasn't in English. So I'm presenting in Spanish, having somebody translate it into Portuguese. And so learning about like, so then what shifts as Black folks if all of the conversation is not in English? How do we talk about it differently? Or do certain words resonate more or less? You know, like certain terms might be radical in one language that isn't in another one. um, that was just very powerful to connect with Black folks in that way and to see like a serious like the presence of serious levels of violence, which is saying a lot. To say like it's exponentially worse in Brazil than it is in the U.S. is saying a lot,
Yeah.
considering how violent it is here. So yeah, so to go to places like that, I got to be a part of a literary festival in Amsterdam, where we got to talk about what does that look like for Black Europeans, for Afro Europeans in that context for Black Joy. Um, I got to like translate a tour on a bus in the western part of Cuba because I was the only person that spoke Spanish and English, and the translator got sick. So
Oh.
they were like, "We're gonna need you to get to the front of the bus." But that was really awesome to be able to, you know, get to know this tour guide who's telling us about this part of the world that I hadn't been to. And she was very Black, and she had plenty to say and connecting like African spiritual traditions to certain things. And it was cool for like those of us who weren't Cuban to connect with that, right? Because we hadn't been to Cuba, and here we are having these like, oh yeah, that makes sense, like that type of conversation. That it was another one of those. Um, there's something that connects us, you
Yeah.
know. Like there's something that connects us, and all of those things have taught me that Black joy can be the entry to understand each other, and understand the things that don't bring us joy. Because again, like in a story like in Brazil, the context was a conference about the violences that were happening. It wasn't, they didn't invite me to like perform on a stage about joy. This was like a really serious thing about how our Black people, and particularly young Black people, being impacted by these serious state violences. That taught me like, yeah, but there was these so many moments of joy that if I tell you a story about that first, now we could talk about how often police are killing Black people in Brazil. Now we could talk about the level of poverty in Brazil and that type of thing, and connect that, right? That we can learn from each other in that way, and it connects. You know that people protesting to wear afros in schools in South Africa connects to like the laws and for the military and armed forces in the U.S. are having a similar struggle. I just think that sometimes the barrier is reasonable in the sense of if we're always being told where our origin is suffering, that's exhausting. Everybody, I know plenty of black folks. You tell me that they like, we're not touching it. If you start talking about like slave, like honestly, if you start
Yeah.
talking about slavery, all these things, like, leave me out. I don't want to
Yeah.
talk about it. I'm here for it all day, for all of it. But there's
Yeah.
people that are like, no, I don't want to talk about that. You know?
It can
That's
be exhausting, like you said. And also, as you were talking about your experiences, like you said, going to all these different places and how this conversation also allowed for this cross cultural connection and dialogue. I think that is really beautiful. And I do think that when we are able to go abroad, actually, sometimes we'll find that Blackness is totally different than what we
Mhm.
expect. And there are communities that connect with us that we're like, oh, wow, I didn't even like know
yeah.
that connection existed. Because it reminds me when I was in law school, I did a summer abroad in Chile. And I was supposed to be studying for like legal stuff or learning about the difference between the laws, but I really love art. So I ended up just connecting with this like group of artists there, and they taught me how to do oil painting.
Wow.
And it was all guys, and I would like go after class and hang out with these guys, and they would be like, "We're black, like you," and I was like, "Wait, what?" I was like, "Wait, wait, like me," because like they didn't look
They
at someone
didn't give it.
I
They didn't give
identify,
it.
as black or skin tone. They would like I'm like you, and I was like, weird, like no, like really,
Wow.
and and they told me about their experiences of the terrible dictatorship that they had there for many years with Pinochet, and how black and indigenous communities were discriminated against, and there was a genocide and all of these things. And but it became this like really beautiful connection. It wasn't sad, it wasn't in a sad space. It was learning from each other. And before I left, one of the things they said to me was like, they were like, "We love your music. We love your music. We listen to your music all the time." And they're like, "Do you know Stevie Wonder?"
Here
And
we
I was
go.
like, Stevie
Like
Wonder? Like,
me? Right.
yeah, like I've heard of Stevie Wonder. And they're
Right.
like, "He's black. So when you go back, you tell him that we love him and that we thank him for his music." And I was like, "You guys, there are a lot of black people in the
Right.
United States." I was like, "There's like a lot
Millions.
of us.
Right.
Like we're not all related." And I
Right.
don't know Stevie Wonder, but I'm sure he would love, this sentiment. But what was a big takeaway for me from that moment was just like you said, that, even blackness is much larger, I think, than we get a picture of in the
Yeah.
United States. And that there are these communities that if we only could sit down with each other and find some connection, whether it's art, or listening to music, or, these dialogues, we could find so many ways to connect our diaspora in ways that are meaningful, for all of us.
I think so too. And that, certain things are universal, though, of course, like colorism, of course, is around the world, and seeing the way that that also played out, and sometimes being present to my being a light skinned black person, how does that impact the experiences that I'm having in these different places? That even in, for example, in South Africa, depending where I was, I could be read as colored, which is different. And that affords me certain things to be in certain places, or the ways that people might treat me. So I think it's also interesting to think about joy, thinking about this experience around Black joy from those types of lenses too. Of these intersections are always around me and playing, or at play, so to speak, and how that in certain contexts, like it seemed in some places it was more of a political identity, if that makes sense, versus
Yeah.
in other places it was reduced to like the tone of your skin is how I'm going to be classifying you, type thing. Um, that yeah, and I think that those types of conversations are important. And again, like the entry can be like this, that
Yeah.
we can talk about the joyful things so that we can get to the shit that's not bringing us joy, because that's taking up space that could be joyful. That's why we got to get rid of it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it
Absolutely.
kind of brings, so just thinking about some of the things that are at play here and some of the things that get in the way. You mentioned in the book, which I really enjoyed, the part you talked about how Arthur Schomburg took the time to connect Langston Hughes with, I
Yes.
believe it was a Cuban poet.
Yes,
Um,
Nicolas Guillen.
yes. And this moment of interaction. And we know that there are a lot of these moments of interaction, this sort of like mass of Black internationalism. So these Black international movements to connect people across the diaspora. And so like this was at a time like before we were calling ourselves a diaspora. Back
Right.
when we were working with Pan-Africanism was like this major unifying concept. And at that point, Pan-Africanism was based on this idea that I would refer to as the underlying African self. So
Yeah.
the idea that we've all heard it, know people who adhere to it. This idea that the differences between diaspora cultures are basically superficial, and underneath it all, there's an African original that we are all exactly the same.
Yeah.
Um, Eventually, though, as Pan Africanism subsided and was replaced by diaspora, one of the reasons it was replaced was because Black political fortunes had diversified.
Yeah.
Some nations were becoming independent, some were still trying to become independent. In nations like the US, and I would imagine also Brazil, the movement was more towards equality than it
Yeah.
was sovereignty. So everybody's now looking in different directions. And so we moved to diaspora with the perspective shifting from this idea of like us being completely the same under the surface to us being utterly different.
Yeah.
And so difference becomes the focus then of saying, okay, it's the part of your culture that isn't like anything else. That's what you really are. Yeah, there may be some connections here and there. And so we saw also as a part of this this stratification, this divergence of political agenda and of support. So even now as we work through diaspora and as we talk about it, there's an acknowledgement, of course, of the cultural connections that exist where they exist and where we continue to inspire each other. But when it comes to things like our politics, our force, things of that nature, those are considered separate in our own. And so we see where you have things like the moment of, in 2020, where Black Lives Matter really exploded. And we have all these marches that happen in all these different places.
Yeah.
But, and a lot of them use the Black Lives Matter slogan. Some of them even spoke about Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. But there wasn't that moment of the movements themselves actually connecting to say, I'm taking on your issue as mine, you're taking on my issue as yours, in the way that we saw during that Pan-Africanist moment where you had, all these people would come together and work together to change political situations in different parts of the diaspora for a certain group of people. So to the extent that we have become very comfortable with talking about um, our cultural connections and not, as you mentioned, not completely comfortable, because there are moments where different people will have different opinions on who qualifies as being part
Yeah.
of the situation. We don't see as much of us connecting on, like, as you said, the things that don't bring us joy, to
Yeah.
say, we need to change this. And not only do we need to change this, we need to change this for each other,
Yeah.
because even if the problem isn't 100% precisely the same, it's strongly recognizable
Yeah.
from the problem that I have. And in some instances, it is 100% exactly the same. So the question that I would have is, how can we start to think, even if it's just the three of us, let's think now, right? Specifically, how can we use joy, as you said, as an entryway to begin to bridge that gap that's been left since we made this transition into diaspora and saying, okay, maybe we get down on culture. We'll see you at Afropunk, but
Yeah.
when it comes time for the election, that's you.
Yeah.
How can we use joy to start to bridge those gaps?
I want to rewind a little bit because I was appreciating some of the things you were saying. That I the distinction between Pan Africanism and diaspora is interesting because I don't use it in that way necessarily. I saw them a little more related. Um, and I also, if I was hearing you correctly about the differences and how that tends to play out more or be, what I was, to say it another way, I think it's less about us, the moment of being focused about around difference, and more who are we paying attention to. Because in my experience, there is a consistent interaction diasporically in that way, whether it's political or social or otherwise. But often, like I said earlier, is where's the camera turned to? And it's not always to those conversations, which I think is a good and bad thing because everything don't got to be amplified. Some things need to be amongst us and only amongst us. We don't got to be putting it out there for everybody to find the transcript, so to speak. But I think part of it is where does the attention lie, and who do we give it to, and why do we give it to them? Because they're told that tradition has never died of people working together across these lines and politics and all of these things. But I think when we're all existing inside of capitalism, then the conversation is always going to be about power, and that's a very attractive thing. And some of the most radical people still want to have power, and I think when that's part of the motivation, that leads us into some places that I don't think we need to be in. But to your question about joy, part of it for me, joy is about healing, being well. It's not just the feeling or like the activity to cultivate it, but it's like the state of being. It's like to be in this work of healing, to be well. Earlier, I was talking about the book "The Salt Eaters" by Tony K. Bambara, and I open that book sometimes just to read the first line so I could laugh and close it, because the first line is, "Are you sure you want to be well, sweetheart?
Yes.
Are you sure, sweetheart, that you want to be well?"
Right.
And that's such an important question. That's such an important question because that's a responsibility to be well, and that um, something I talk a lot about in terms of Black joy is that part of it is that it gives us the opportunity to imagine and practice that imagination of what is it that we want beyond the revolutions, so to speak. What's in that world? And for me, since the beginning, I've envisioned it as us being as healed or in the healing as much as possible to be well. That's what I want for us, and that the same way that hurt people, healing or healed people heal people. And the more of us that have that space, the more it's a generous. It's I feel like it's related to love, and this is coming to me in this moment, but it's related to love. That love is a generous thing,
Mm.
and I think healing can be that too, because part of being free is having love, or love is part of that freedom, and so. Um, that's something that needs to be extended, and that joy offers the opportunity to be well. That is part of why your shoulders kind of relax and you have a little smile sometimes, even when that word is mentioned, even if it's never been asked to you before. Is that as Brian was saying earlier, it's that thing that like it's a blessing. We don't that doesn't have to be That's part of who we are. You know
Mm.
what I'm saying? That is like the opportunity is always to evoke it or to bring it forth or to say like it's safe to have that here. We can do this together, type thing. Because this is also making me think about almost every person I've asked that question about what does Black joy mean to you. They've had at least one other person be in that response, and to me that signals the community or like the collectivity around it again. So to your question about how we could use joy is also to just bring people together, and that's part of the first thing anyways, is can we get in a room, and then we could get to whatever the agenda is.
Mm.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just interesting as you're talking about some of the words that came up and you're saying like power and healing. We've been talking about that a lot just here at home over the past couple of weeks. And I know there's people love these like power lists that come out like I'm on the top, and I'm just like, what is this? Does this help
Yeah,
like us in any way? Whatsoever. And we talk about power is illusory in so many ways. Power is something that we give to
yes,
someone else. And as I've talked to friends over the last couple of weeks, everyone's like, what are we going to do 2025? What's going to happen? I'm like, well, first of all, don't give your power away
yeah,
to this next group of people who's going to come in. I mean, it's not like
yeah,
we have to sit here and we're going to be like, "Ah, they're going to, we're almost sitting here like our parents are going to come home and punish us." It's like, what are we doing here? Like, we don't have to do
yeah,
that.
yeah,
We need to be thinking of, like you said, what is the world we want to see, and how do we just create that in our daily interactions? And I think that healing and love is such a big part of that. And it's
yeah,
interesting because there's the healing that's necessary from any trauma that you've lived through. Just living in places where there is anti-blackness is traumatic.
inheriting it, right?
Inheriting these traumas, and then when you heal, you are more open to love, but also that we have to help. I think there's this aspect I'm seeing where it's like we have to help others who are not open to love yet, that
Yeah,
they don't even realize. I think there's a lot of us in our communities that have been so traumatized
of
that
course.
we don't even realize that we don't want to accept love. We don't want to
Is it
accept.
always safe? Is it safe
Yeah,
to love? Is it
it's
safe to be me? Is it safe to um, be in the world as I am? I don't think so always. Um, yeah, yeah. And that I'm also, what's coming to mind is that there's levels to all of this. And that some of us, like this is a privilege that we have the privilege to be able to sit on a computer and we have the capacity to do this. I mean, this is part of our livelihood. This is not like a volunteer situation. But what I'm saying is, but then of course, like what about the, like last week I was at the career day for my middle school. Shout out to 303 in the Bronx. And my assistant principal who's still there, she was making a good point about like, there's parents that are working 5 jobs and stuff to make sure that their kids are good. And how do you tell that person, oh well, there's room for joy, like, and I actually believe that we do get to tell her there's room for joy and that in her world or in some capacity that's there. What I'm saying is we get to be conscious of that though. And how do we make sure that even somebody who's working 5 jobs to make ends meet with kids and shit is getting that same level, if not more, of that type of love and joy and space to cultivate it as the person who like can afford to be going on vacation every week or every other week or whatever. You know what I mean? That
yeah.
um, class sometimes get tied to these conversations, and sometimes it can make it seem as simple as like the thing around excuse me, self-care, how
Yes.
like it got like self-care comes from Audre Lorde talking about working through cancer in the 80s, and somehow now it's like if I just put on a face mask and you know what I'm saying, and it's no shade to any of that, but what I'm saying is like the root of that was about black women like a black queer woman asserting the vitality, it's not even the importance of taking care of herself while she's literally like physically ill, but just in general the power of that and how that impacts her community and the people around her. That I think joy can have that level as well, because that same mom, and my mom didn't work 5 jobs, but she worked her ass off as a young mom of twins, that she totally cultivated joy in my life, like deeply. And that's part, again, the beginning of my story is that I put a picture of my mom. The first picture of the Black Joy Project was my mom. So she is such a like symbol of Black joy in my life, that I think that's important too, to name all the ways that shows up as well. That the joy that she brought was her smiles sometimes, but also it's like, I'm not supposed to say it, but the golden arches back in the day on Fridays, you know what I mean? Or like, just things like that. That's a ways that we call, and all of that matters too. So that we never, I never wanted to devolve into like this list of this is what Black joy is,
Yeah.
and if it's not on that list or if it doesn't look this way, then it's not that. When as many of us as exist, there's that many way that the joy can exist or be created. That yeah, I don't know if I'm making sense what I'm saying.
No,
No,
you are.
absolutely,
You
absolutely.
made me think
And
too of like,
and
look, those golden arches when you were a kid
I
and you were
mean,
like in the car and you could convince
Maybe
your parents to stop at Mickey D's. You were like, I won. Like
right,
that was
in the
happy.
box.
Yep.
Yeah.
right. And we know the complicated relationship that
Yeah.
it has to health in our community. We know the complicated relationship it has to, the incoming administration and all that. But nevertheless, on some level, you're like, it saved my life too many times
Yeah. You
when
know
it
what I
was
mean?
nothing
Like
else I could afford to go eat.
That's right.
birthday parties,
Birthday
like
parties, right?
that's
Was there for
Yes,
it. Yeah.
the little playground that they
are you
had.
Yes.
kidding me? You got to play in the thing, get a Happy Meal, and there was cake.
Yes.
It's so true. It's so true.
But you bring up a really important point also, in terms of that person who does have 5 jobs, or
Yeah.
the person who is engaging in self care not because they saw it on an influencer's Instagram, but because it's a vital part of maintaining their health.
Yeah.
And so that brings up the distinction that is made between joy and happiness.
Yeah.
And if you could just kind of take us through that a little bit, and then I want to ask a really cynical question, just because I want to see you like knock it out of the park. But it is a question
Oh,
that will come up when you talk about joy. That's why I want to make sure to include it. But first, kind of just what is the distinction? What is the difference between happiness and joy?
I think the simplest way I've understood it is to go back to what's been said a few times is joy is intrinsic. So it's something that comes from within. And happiness, and to that effect, often is a deeper feeling or like sensation, longer lasting maybe. and happiness is more extrinsic. It's like the thing from, you bought a nice something, or you put on some makeup, or whatever the thing was, that those are more ephemeral or like fleeting in a way. That I think, yeah, joy is just, it's that thing that can be taken away. So it comes from within versus happiness that can be evoked extrinsically.
Mm.
Yeah. And I thought that was really well put in the way that it kind of stacks the two up beside each other. That
Yeah,
he's
they're cousins.
right. And so
Mm.
it's like joy comes from within, and the conditions you have within. Happiness comes from without. Joy is more lasting. Happiness is more ephemeral. And I'm also hearing, and just in the conversation we had to this point, joy is more communal, and
Yes.
happiness can be more, uh, you know,
Individual.
right, individualistic. I was trying not to say selfish, but but or self-centered. But joy, happiness can be more just about me. Whereas one of the things we've been saying over and over again is, in order to have joy, in order to really have joy, one of the first things that joy does is it looks for someone else to be joyful with, or
That's
someone
right.
else to bring joy to.
That's right.
Whereas if I'm talking about happiness, then that's just me. That's just what I
Well, I'll
can do.
say black joy when we add black to the
Mm.
joy.
Black
That's
joy.
the
Yeah. See, I'm sorry. Yes,
I
my
like that
black was
qualifier.
implied, but yes, no, you're absolutely right. Let's be clear about black joy.
yeah.
And so one of the things that, so here's where the cynical question comes up, that I really wanted to kind of like, because I know this is a thing that will come up,
Yeah.
and that is when we talk about happiness, the way you describe in the book, as being attached to these external, ephemeral things.
Yeah.
Um, Basically what we would consider to be like the material possessions and wealth, and the comforts and things like that. The question then becomes, and you talk about imagination, and you inevitably, someone will ask, well, is black joy simply what's left for black people when happiness is denied?
No.
Because those things are always kept from us. And so when we talk about imagination, like, are we imagining joy simply because we can't grasp happiness because it's always being kept out of our reach?
That's interesting because for me, the distinction is not with judgment. It's literally just to distinguish those two terms so that we're clear how one impacts us differently from the other. And um, the material thing, I think that yes, that's something that we may not have always been given access to, but yeah, I think it's. I don't think it's I don't see it as one or the other, or being denied one to have the other. It's more of just being clear, the distinction of that. It's you can have, like, there's no shade. If you want to have the things, that's fine.
Mhm.
But if we're being honest, like, does that really bring you joy to have? And some people might say yes. Like, they might actually sit with that and be like, joy is having every luxury, everything. Like, that really is joy to me. And who am I to deny them that? I just wonder, but for real though, if you really sat with that, if you really had to define joy, it's probably not going to be the things, the tangible things that you're going to define as joy or what brings you joy. Even though sometimes it can. And what I'm saying is, it's just to create a distinction so that we can have clarity around that. And then that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the consciousness. And inside of that, then we get to create differently. But I'm not saying that because the truth is, in reality, everydayness, joy and happiness get conflated. Those are not like distinct terms. I don't think. I think people use them interchangeably all the time. Joy and
Yeah.
happiness. I was just offering, not just, what I'm offering is a distinction so that we can say this is this and that is that, and then either of those things can exist at the same time. And if we're talking about joy, then there's levels to that, right? Of like, then if we're really on the same page about it being an internal thing, then what do we want to cultivate internally, or what do we already know? Because I think the other thing is, with me and all of this, I didn't make up Black Joy. This I inherited this. You know what I'm saying? So, which means that I inherited something that came before me, before us, and so there's wisdoms that come with that. There's technologies, knowledges that we gain from that, and so I think the opportunity is also to build on top of it. Like, everything. Some things did work. Everything, we don't have to throw everything away.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly. No,
absolutely.
exactly. There have
Yeah.
been those blueprints, and I love the idea of like you said, it's inherited. It makes me think a lot of, grandmothers, great grandmothers, just thinking of when even my own childhood, like they were the people that always kept the family together, always kept, like, if there was always something going on, always somebody arguing about something or somebody didn't get along, and they were just like, we're gonna all sit here together, Sunday dinner, it doesn't matter, like put all of
Yeah.
that away, and just finding ways for us to survive,
Yeah.
really, and thrive, in a family, community. And when I got sick, and at the point where I was really like in a very bad place and close to death, I called on like all of my female ancestors. I was just like,
Yes.
just help me, like I don't know what this is. I don't know if I'm going to make it, but and I really thought about them a lot, and how, just like you said, I mean, they kept joy always. And these were times that now I can read about and go like, this was not easy. This
You
was
know what I mean?
difficult. It was challenging. There was no money, or there was a little bit of money, or everybody's trying to figure stuff out, and how they kept those moments that I can still reflect on, of the Sunday dinners. Or we're from Philly, so in Philly you always listen to oldies on Sunday
Sunday night.
nights.
Yep.
That that's like that is, we still do that in our house.
Uh,
Just laughter that would happen around the table, and life was hard, but there was always joy. There was always love present.
because what you're naming is the truth, right? That like the way I put it is peace is always the exception, not the rule. That it's always been wars and chaos and all of it. You know what I'm saying? Like there actually has never been a moment in history that is like, oh, everybody just got along.
Yeah. So,
Like
we're
that
good.
literally,
We're good.
yeah, like that's not true. There's never been a moment where everybody just got along and there was this golden era where the world was in harmony. Like that's not real. Which is why that's interesting that we start to even talk. You know what I'm saying? Like it's funny we still have to say that
Yeah.
because we tend to be revisionist about like, well, the good old days and that type of thing. But it's yes and, which is one of the chapters in the book of
Mhm.
yes, and of course, like in the background though, you name the era, things were, you know what I'm saying? Literally the Harlem Renaissance was the background was the peak of the KKK. That
Yeah.
Yeah.
was like some of the most violent eras of US history was during the Harlem Renaissance against
Yeah.
black folks. Like
Yeah.
that is, and that's what I mean is that tension. Like that is not that like that's such an intense insight, right? That in the face of one of the most violent eras of this country, we have one of the most memorable, thriving moments of art, of black art and literature and culture and that type of thing. That those things are always inextricably linked. Like that's not a coincidence that that was happening. You understand? Of like, and that's part of what I'm feeling in these last couple of weeks is that similar of like, yes, and not for nothing is the 20s again. That um, yeah, like that the what really like really look at what we get to do in the face of these things, you know, and that like Ida B. Wells is out here writing articles, buying newspapers to get the word out, traveling across to the UK to let people know about lynching while it's happening. It's not like it stopped and she was reporting about it. It's literally happening. She's being threatened to be lynched while she's doing stuff like that. That I think we have to remember history and the people that came before us in that way, that complexity too. That it wasn't, and that's the importance of remembering their joys. You know, of like reading. I don't know if y'all read Ida B. Wells' autobiography, but it's incredible.
Not,
And she has like some really joyful moments in that book of, you know, even when it's like she went through a similar epidemic of yellow fever where she ended up her parents died and she had to take on all of her siblings because she didn't want them to be separated. But she's still able to describe like some of the joys of even in the intensity of basically becoming a mom to like five kids under 20s. She's like not even 20 something yet. um, that she's taking on this huge responsibility, but it meant the love of her keeping her siblings together, you know, and then later she gets to like support them in other ways. That we have to remember stuff like that. Zora Neale Hurston, I was just talking about this earlier in the week in Barracoon, when she's describing how she, I'm forgetting his name right now, but the subject of the book, that part of her getting related to him or familiar was the small things of like bringing him watermelon or like taking him on errands because he needed things, and she didn't want it to just be transactional. Like this lady, imagine this lady pulling up in a really nice car. He's like, "What? A black woman driving a car and a nice one? What is going on here? Like, what do you
Right,
want?" I'd be suspicious too. Like, what do
right.
you
You
want?
had no reason to trust her. He's like,
Yeah.
what's going on?
Yes. You know what I'm saying? That is like, what is going on here? So for her, but what I'm saying is like those moments, or like in the book where I talk about with Malcolm X, and as a child learning how to cultivate land because his family, his parents are Garveyites, and they're, like they're committed to, we got to figure out the big thing, like not just getting away from these people, but how are we going to sustain ourselves? But just the beauty of like a Malcolm X child looking at the sky. He just planted peas, and he's thinking about what's going to happen with the peas. Whatever a child is thinking about. But what I'm saying is like, if we get to have access to those stories too, of
Yes.
like not just remembering the harshness of Malcolm. I forgot I was wearing the t-shirt.
Uh,
Not just the harshness of Malcolm X, because I think he tends to be remembered in that way. But that like there was moments even in his childhood that totally impacted this person that we remember. That I feel like that does something for us. It does something for me to know those types of stories, and it makes those people feel more real. Of
yeah.
like they had those types of experiences too. Everybody wasn't a Broadway star, a superstar activist from the jump. Like people
Yeah.
had lives.
And
Yeah.
we talk about that a lot too, in terms of putting a human face on history and the understanding, like we remember people in terms of like icons and archetypes,
Right.
but they were human beings that were, living their life. They were experiencing life a second at a time, the same way that all of us do, and trying to recover some of that perspective of them as we look back on them. And it
Right.
brings up some other things just in terms of the approach that you take to Black joy, and then saying, which I feel is so incredibly important. You didn't invent it. You're like, I didn't invent Black joy. I
No.
inherited this. And, a lot of my schooling and a lot of the work that we do is in theory. These different types of social or political theories and things we get very broad and very expansive and very intricate and very complicated. And one of the things that I found is most important in working in theory, and which will usually lead to the best ones, is remembering that at absolute best, you have to remember you are not trying to create anything new. You're trying to describe an experience that is already happening. So that's a totally different thing than sitting and going like, I'm going to create this entirely new model or framework for reality, as opposed to going, no, reality already exists. This is happening. I just need to be able to describe the experience as well as I possibly can. And it relieves the tension of necessarily trying to, for example, make space for things, because we're always
Yeah.
trying to make space for stuff that's already here.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't need to create space for this thing to exist. It already exists, or for these people to exist, for this experience to have. This experience is already happening. I just have to get
Yeah.
out of its way. I need
Yeah.
to just figure out how I can not be the worst part of it.
Yeah.
Experience that's already going on. And when you start to think that way, a lot of things become a lot easier. And the reason it brought that up for me was thinking that was very much the same place that we started with in talking about our last book, AphroChic,
Yeah.
um, talking about the Black family home. Because part of it was going, well, we didn't invent the Black family home.
Right.
we, we
Right.
didn't we didn't make these up. We're not the first ones to have them. So it's like, how do I speak to this thing in a constructive way without necessarily speaking for it in a way,
Yeah.
as you said before, I don't want to list out here is what Black joy is, and if it's not on this list, it doesn't work. And
Right.
we face the same thing, trying to say, okay, well, what is an African American approach to interior design? Because a lot of times when you're talking about design styles, they'll be very definitive. It is these things, which implies, if not outright states, it is not these other things. And we knew that we had to do it in a way that didn't limit, the what we know to be the massive diversity of the Black experience.
Can I ask a
So,
question?
Yeah.
oh yeah, absolutely.
I think that's so interesting. So if I'm hearing you, you're saying that it was like a challenge to distinguish African American. What's the word you used? I don't know.
Uh, Interior design, African American.
Yeah, yeah. Like the is you're saying that there is one, or that it has to be expansive? I mean, that there isn't one, or that has to be expansive.
Well, we contend that there is one. We've always, so it's a question we've gotten a lot of times, and a lot of times we go like, well, if there's, you know, Black food and Black music and Black dance, then it makes sense that there would be Black interior
Yeah.
design, just like there's Italian
I,
interior, Japanese, what have you.
yeah.
So, but for us, it was about saying, okay, looking at it, less as an aesthetic and more as a
And,
cultural artifact,
okay.
and saying, understanding that, okay, well, as a cultural artifact, we need to evaluate in terms of what it does. And in terms of what it does is can be very specific to context. So, in trying to figure out how to best articulate this, we knew that it could never be something as simple as going, okay, well, there are these colors and these patterns and these furniture styles. Because
Sure.
one of the first things you see when you look at Black homes is we have an infinite number of styles.
Yeah.
So to bring it down to any one set of parameters in that way, in the way that design styles are usually defined, means excluding the
Sure.
vast majority of what it is that we actually do. So
Sure.
what we did was we actually started talking about it in terms of, okay, well, what does it do for Black people? What does it do for African Americans? And we'll get to why we were specific in that way for in a second. And I was saying, we said that it came down to 5 key elements that we said were safety, control, recognition, celebration, and memory. Like
Yeah.
these are the roles. These are essentially the questions that interior design answers for African Americans.
Yeah.
And now we said specifically African Americans or Black Americans, with the understanding that while every African American is Black, not every Black American is African American.
Yes.
But the way in which those needs are crafted, the way in which those questions form, are specifically tied to the historical and current conditions of life in America for Black people. So, for example, when we talk about something like recognition, we kind of move that. Actually, in the book, we refer to it as visibility, and we've sort of moved on from that because it's not just about being seen the way that we
Yeah.
talk about it, because being seen is just about when and where you show up, and recognition is more about how and why. you know
Yes.
so when we start talking about recognition, and that kind of is, well, that means something very different in America, where we can see someone is flipping a switch that says, okay, now Black people can show up on screen, and then after every decade or so they flip the switch the other way, and now we slowly start to vanish from
Sure.
screen. That means something very different in a place like Ghana, Nigeria,
Right. Right.
Jamaica, where the whole makeup of the society is Black. So now recognition, memory means something very different here in the US, where we are systematically excised from national and communal memory. And you talked about that in the book as well. Joy as a bulwark, as a barricade against that type of disappearing. But that's very different in places where the nation is Black, the community, the culture is Black, the political structure is Black. So those types of efforts aren't going on. So for us, it was about like, how do we shape that in quite the right way? But I hope
Thank you
that's
for
the question. I know it's
it
kind of
does. It does. No, I was asking because that's something I tried to touch on, not that specifically, but just the something I think this fits to what we're talking about. I know you had a question, but I think this fits of
Mhm.
something I observed from the traveling and stuff was this question of like blackness, of course, right? But what I'm saying is how sometimes it's being filtered in places outside of the U.S. through this, like, I think contrived African Americanness, if that makes sense. So it's like this very reductive, like reality TV, and just very hyper. It's not the everydayness of it,
Yeah.
but that's obviously being wielded by these mostly white corporations that are pushing these things out. What I'm saying though is that like sometimes I've felt like that distinction is that it's not respected, the sacredness of it as an ethnicity, if that makes sense. That
Interesting.
I've experienced African Americanness as like sometimes it's supposed to be this malleable thing that everyone gets a piece of, but then the other form, and I might be saying something controversial here, but the other forms have more of a guard, if that makes sense. Like there's a distinction that I just appreciate that y'all made that one because I think it's important as a way to be clear that when we're saying diaspora and that type of thing, like this is an ethnic group
Mm.
that like the people over here, and how that ties very complexly to all these other forms of blackness. And I think part of what happens is because of empire, it's being in the U.S. beyond black folks' control is how that gets disseminated and then used against other Black people. Because something I talk about in the book is how when I learned in the Netherlands, talking to someone who's had been working in the media for a long time, and her thought was like, if we can play the Cosbys in the Netherlands, then there has to be room for Black Dutch families on TV, and that basically there wasn't. And how like there was this thing around, well, that's Black and y'all are Dutch, if you know what I mean. So it's like this thing that then it polices is the word, as
Mhm.
opposed to like just existing at the same time of like, this is a type of Black people, we're a type of Black people. There's some similarities, and that's why I would want to have my own show, because the Cosby's is reflecting a Black experience, not necessarily ours. If that makes
Right,
sense.
exactly.
Right.
It's
And
interesting. Well, I
So
just
that,
think it's interesting you say that because it's really a lot about the commodification, right, of
yes,
like Black bodies and particularly in a place like the United States, understanding or treating still as something for sale, as a product
yes,
that can then be streamed all over the world, whether it's like this entertainer or, something that is in our fashion style or music, whatever it is, it's constantly utilized as something that the United States puts out as a product to other places in the world. And I think that that does create a lot of, dehumanization
yes,
of the African American experience, in particular. And yeah, and they call it like cultural production. And I do love what I love about your work, and honestly, a lot of the work that's been coming out in the last few years is it being authentic and
yes,
true to not just an African American experience, but to Black lived experience. Like, who are we really? And I do think that that is so hard to find when we are in, social media and even television. And so it's just wonderful that we talked about a little bit about Black joy as this gift, and that you created this
yes,
gift that actually, when we open it, we can actually see ourselves. And
yes,
you've said clarity a few times, but we can, and I think that's so important. You would see ourselves clearly, see that joy clearly and what it is. And then also see, like you said, that it's an inheritance, that we are resilient, that these are times we've had lots of bad times. Like you said, there's not any time in the world where there has just been peace. We have not reached
oh,
uh, utopia in any way whatsoever, but that this is something that can be not only honest, but it can be an active tool for people. This book that they can use today. You've talked about students and those things. How are you imagining the Black Joy Project as a tool that
yeah,
people can utilize in their lived experience right now?
before we,
yeah,
I actually,
He's going to take. Just
yeah,
going
I'm
to
gonna take
interrupt.
that. We're gonna move that. We're gonna move that out the way. We're gonna come back to it. But there's something that you were just saying that just started to pull a lot of things together for me,
okay,
and I want to see if there's any validity in this, because you talked about um, the African American experience as
yeah,
something that everybody gets a part of, and there's a recognition of that when we are marketed overseas, it's not us
right,
primarily ours that does the marketing. So we're
yeah,
not responsible for the ways in which we get represented, or the offers that get made.
yeah,
And same thing, vice versa. You were talking about Cuba, and when we were talking about Cuba, one of the first things that came to mind is like, yes, and when you see Cubans on TV, you never see how many Black people are there, and the
yo,
same is
that's
true
true.
in so many parts of the world where places we think of, oh well, there's no diversity there, and you're like, no, there's Black people all over the place there. You just don't see them. Um, and so part of that is also at the same time an internalization of certain racist perspectives on our part as a
Yeah,
global community, right? Because
yeah,
one of the things, like the American understanding of the African American, and specifically of the African American culture, and therefore the basis on which it gets marketed is that this is a thing that everyone can partake of, because America seems to labor under the delusion that we're actually figments of its collective imagination, and therefore everything that we produce is somehow by extension, their automatic IP.
Yeah.
And so then they can kind of distribute that around the world. And so one of the things that we've seen is happen, and we touched on this a little bit in talking about some of the tensions that can exist even between our communities, is the idea that um, we've internalized the idea that the African Americans are free, that Black people are free, depending
Yeah.
on where you're coming from, right? And
Yeah.
so we even where we've seen, articles or issues or moments where people have stepped up, even against other members of the diaspora, and said, you're using this thing, you're using this icon or this element or this symbol or whatever. That's mine. You can't have it.
Yeah.
You know, but no one seems to think that about African American culture. So even while someone is saying that to African Americans, like there was an article in Afropunk and all this, and they're going, "You can't get it," but this person is like listening to hip hop, rocking blue jeans, doing this, this whole thing.
Yeah.
But the point is not, like as you said, to sit in judgment on any perspective within that, but just kind of like to look at the root cause. And I'm thinking in some way of how joy can act as an antidote to sort of these sort of like petty racisms that we internalize about each other.
Mm.
Because there are things that get said about Black people that we will defend to the death for what we think to be like sort of our community. But then we'll
Yeah.
turn around and say, oh, but those people over there,
Yeah.
don't be like them, or don't associate, or don't bring them over, or things like that, right? And so there's an extent to which we divide ourselves in competition over what, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, is basically a global bottom. Like we're fighting to be, to basically among ourselves say, well, I'm better at being the bottom than, what have you. So one of the things that struck me about the book was how international it was, where you were talking about joy amongst, like Tuareg metal workers and, different people weaving rugs and baskets and things like that. Uh, there's some aspects of Tuareg culture that I'm actually a pretty big fan of. Um,
My favorite jewelry style in the whole world.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So I think what I'm trying to figure out, what I'm trying to ask is the role of joy in changing before we even consider how, the state of the rest of the world with regard to anti-Black racism. How can joy help us to transform the way that we see each other so that we can start to stop getting in each other's way and sort of become closer as a community across borders or without borders?
I mean, the answer to that is really complicated, and I will say it feels like a different way to ask Janine's question about a tool,
I think
but
so
Yeah.
what is
too.
it? It does. It feels like a different. It feels like it's the same question of, which to me, part of it is just to be able to be in reality around like these complexities, because it goes both ways. The same way that I believe there's an inauthentic dissemination of what African American culture is around the world. The ways that we get communicated about other types of Black people here is also very like
Yes.
myopic or distorted in a way because it's so selective. I mean, now it's a little bit different because we have the internet and TikTok and all these things that you literally like. Some of the people I follow is like, yeah, it's amazing the type of experiences that you can now have access to because of something like that. That is very true to that person and not behind like some giant corporation deciding what it's going to look like. And so I think that joy is a way to do that. Like a story. It's in the book, and I tell it a lot. Is when I went to that conference in Brazil on the last day, it was the first couple of days was at the University of Sao Paulo in the law school, and the last day was inside of this like a it was a samba school, and the building though it looked like a plane hangar. Imagine like a plane hangar, and it's in the hood essentially, the periferia, which is like the periphery, the outskirts of Sao Paulo. And we're in the samba school, and so the vision was that the last day of this conference, they wanted the conference because it was mostly organized by community organizers, for it to end on that note too, of like how do we leave from an action place and not just talking. And so we got to select working groups, and mine was gender-based violence. which is interesting because it was gender-based violence, but the majority was women that were in the group talking about their experiences, and femme queer people. But in that moment, there was somebody crying like so intensely that it was piercing through the room. And so it turns out that that was the mother of a child that had been killed by the police. And around us, imagine like banners, long banners of young people, like their pictures and their names that had been killed by the police. And all these different things are just reminding us of the reality inside of a samba school. And then like fast forward to the break, like around the lunch break, and somebody starts drumming, and then somebody gets on the mic and starts chanting, and now people are dancing and stuff. And I don't, at that time, like I speak Spanish, but obviously I don't speak Portuguese, and so I'm trying to piece it together, like what the vibe is there, but like what's
Right.
going on. And then I later, like playing it back, the video, I realized that they were actually singing about the military forces that were causing some of those violences, and the chanting was that they believe that those forces can come down and that they can persevere that. And to me, like that moment is like so many of us can relate to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
A
Yes.
song that moves us, that is upbeat, and but the message is that we can overcome that, we will overcome that type thing. That I think joy offers those types of moments, because all of the things I said before that moment were not joyful. It was a mother crying out of grief from her child being murdered. We're in I'm sitting for like a couple hours listening to women talk about their experiences of gender-based violence in the Brazilian context. That in the same experience is this really incredible moment of people like singing and drumming and chanting and things, and genuinely smiling and joyful around their belief that they can, as a collective, will have this, like, overcome this level. I think joy has the power to do that, because that required us to be present in that moment, but also future thinking of like what else is possible. And that the drumming and things is, again, that's an inherited practice. So it's like the past, present, and future all happening at once. I think joy is a space for that, or can be, of, because that's blackness. It's not linear. It's always like non chronological and that type of thing. That I think joy offers that, the opportunity to be with each other for real. And we all, especially if you're a black person that's been able to travel, but I think even if you've gone to a different neighborhood where you are, you know that feeling of like when you see somebody else and it's like, what's up? Like that type of thing. That really does something though. That's very powerful that we can do that. You could literally not know nobody,
Yeah.
and just a little head nod, and it's like, all right, at least we're good for that. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
Right.
I don't know you, but cool. Like, I acknowledge your existence. That's really powerful, because everybody's not like that.
Yeah. I think
And that's
that,
something.
yeah, I just love how you said the powerfulness of it, and it just makes me think about at there was a question that was in my mind and it just went away. But you were talking earlier about getting the DMs, and at the time when you first started Black Joy Project, I'm curious as to what are the conversations now, 2 weeks
Yeah.
to this, everyone feeling like the air has been sucked out of them and just going like, oh my God, we got to step back. Almost feel like we're going to step right back into this horribleness again. And you've written this book, The Black Joy Project. I'm assuming that you're blowing up. I'm assuming people are like, please,
Right.
Cleaver,
From
like,
your lips to God's ears.
like find the joy.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I'm interested in, we were talking a lot about, what we learned from, the elders, and then those who have been, honestly, it sounds to me like when you're talking about that group, that sounds like to me like people who have been in activism work for a
Yes.
long time. And I started out in activism work myself, and was worked on domestic violence prevention and sexual assault prevention. And that, was hard work. But what I learned from so many of the women that I worked with was, man, they love to laugh, they love
Yes.
to party, they love to go out, they love life. And that was a vital part of being able to do the work. It wasn't like we were sitting in the office every day, like
Right.
super depressed, because
Yeah.
like, okay, yeah, I'm going to write legislation and we got to go, we're going to meet these people and do this. But there was always the sense of joy. I feel like younger people, and these people were like, they were probably 30, 40 years older. So they're in their 70s, 80s now. I'm in my 40s. So I feel like they knew how to do it with kind of the things you're talking about, like love, joy, healing at the center, so that they could do the really hard work. I feel like now, because we are so exposed to everything all the time, it's very hard for people to stay centered on
I think
any of those things. It's almost like every day is grief, every day is a tragedy, every day you're reading about some horrible thing. So I'm curious, as we move into 2025, and you might be having dialogues about Black joy at this moment,
yeah.
what are you talking to people about, or what are the things that are helping you as we all kind of prepare to face challenges that are ahead?
I appreciate that question. Honestly, and as you're asking, I'm like, I think this may not be the norm, but the people around me, the energy has been very focused. Like, we got to do the things that we came to do because, oh, I guess we were talking about this right before we started on the live, but the reality of like the last couple of weeks, which isn't again, because we unfortunately went through this already. Well, we didn't go through this, but we've seen what he gives. That, but what I'm saying is, I remember that in 2016, that similar feeling of like the next morning, I should say, of being frustrated with coworkers and stuff, of like people just being upset. I'm like, where was the tears for all of the other things, no shade, that have been happening? Like, where was the tears and the people being able to not speak when we're having to watch? Like, how do you think I felt when I woke up and saw Sandra Bland was hanging in a jail cell? You know what I'm saying? Like, those types of things. So what I'm saying is, to go back to something that we've said a few times, is if peace is the exception always, that it feels like the people around me, our energy is, we got to do what we got to do, like for real. And because the we're in an evolving thing, so it's also giving the space to be whatever we need to be as well. Of like, that's phony. Everybody's not gonna be joyful every day. I don't wake up every moment of every day believing like this is it. It's all rainbow and sunshine. Like, that's not true. I'm an artist, which means I'm sensitive, and there's days that I'm like, or even honestly, the part of the journey of writing the book, of it feeling like a test of, I need to make sure that I'm really about this life, because the level of challenge that is happening to make this book happen makes it feel like I need to make sure that this is not a performance. That I want to be able to speak from a place when these moments, like I'm literally imagining these moments years ago, of knowing that when this time came, that I wanted to be able to speak from an authentic place. That it wasn't just, I knew how to beautifully string words together around joy and make you feel good in that way, but that it was really coming from, no, this is real. And the articulation is about things that we actually can engage with for real, imaginations or thoughts and ideas that we can engage with for real, and how that can manifest materially in our lives. Because I think it's both, it's not one or the other. We do have to have shifts in the mind, to like quote Steve Biko. Like, we have to free ourselves, liberate ourselves mentally first before the other things can happen. But there is something about materially being free that's really important. Um, that,
Yeah.
yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Yeah, it
no, and
does.
I,
And I
I
think,
think that
okay.
the vibe is something that we feel too. I was like, I think that day, like we found out what happened. We had kind of taken ourselves away from social media and all of that. We actually had a really peaceful day the day after the election, and then like a friend called and like broke the news to us. But we were just like, yeah, it was like, at first it was like, oh, okay, you're kidding, and then it was like, oh man, and then by the end of the day, after we had gone through all the emotions, we were like, all right, well, tomorrow we got to get to work. Like,
This is nuts.
we
This
sent
is
a
nuts.
letter,
This is
you
like,
know.
it's like that. The reality is, of like, the thing too is, it's also too soon to feel the effect of it. So I'm gonna be in this right now, because what we can do is whatever we need to do to lead up to this. Because the truth is, the party's just getting started on whatever is happening over there. That, we have to be real about that too, and that I'm in a position where because of my privileges and lack thereof, there's certain things that I can take on that I want to, because others of us, like I'm not immediately concerned about my access to hormones, for example, because I'm not in a certain space around that, but I'm concerned about my friends and the people around me, whether I know them or not, that need to have access to that, or if we're talking about family planning, like people need to have access to that. Like,
Yeah.
why are we blocking people from abortion and that type of thing? That um, yeah, and so when I say the focus is focusing on what we have control and ability and access around,
Mm.
so that we can address the things that we don't. Because that's part of that's the issue, is that we just got put in a position where that power is really intended to be taken from us. And yeah, I know, I was going to say I don't know about y'all, but I think we're on the same team that we're not going to go down without swinging.
Oh
So,
yeah, no, we're here. We're in that. We're in the fight, and I think that what I am seeing online, I expected to see a lot of like depression, but I saw a lot. I saw Black folks like they're doing art. People are creating. People are still moving forward, and I was like, this is different. Actually, it felt different than 2016. It felt
yeah,
like that there was some fortification that's happened in these last 4 years, especially since the Black Lives Matter movement. And honestly, there was a lot of like, well, now I don't have to hold back anything because you're not
right,
holding back.
right.
I don't have to hold back either. I don't have to hide. I don't have to censor myself. And I need to come as my most authentic self in every single thing I do. Everything has to have meaning. Everything has to be about the principles I believe in. And I will not leave anything on the table. I must do all of that.
Yes.
And I think I do feel joyful when I wake up because I'm like, all right, like
That's
I'm ready, like let's go,
yes.
so that is definitely how I feel, ready to, meet the challenges, but more importantly, ready to be there for each other.
I'm
Um,
really happy to hear that, because I do want to hold space for the people that it really fucked them up. Like some people are terrified, like they really are not sure about what's to come. Even thinking about undocumented people, of like that's a really serious looming thing around massive deportation that again already exists in the world. Part of my work has been through another collective called We Are All Dominicans. Shout out to them, who that entity formed around a law that was passed in 2013 in the Dominican Republic that effectively denationalized hundreds of thousands of people, the people who are Dominicans of Haitian descent, Haitian migrants. The reason I bring it up, though, is because that's a relatively small country that has already been practicing massive deportations of Black people across borders because of the political and social environments that are anti-Black and anti-Haitian specifically, and classist, amongst other things. That what I'm saying is like that is possible, and that's been going on for decades. For the last 10 years, it happened. It's legally sanctioned in a certain way, but it was already happening before that. And it is very foolish to believe that in the U.S. something like that couldn't happen, because the people that are being penalized, it was retroactive to 1925. So for example, that's like here in the U.S. I'm being told that I'm no longer U.S. citizen because my grandmother wasn't born in the U.S. It's that level, that type of stuff can be done here, and I think that's important to be present to. What I'm saying is we get to have the fear and all of that, and then those of us like us who can hold the space for the other things, we have to, because we can, and I want to. I feel like because I can, I want to, and that's important too, that we don't all have the same responsibilities in this. I think sometimes it's made to seem like you just get your piece, and then no, we don't all have the same work to do here. We don't.
yeah.
And I think one of the things that you've touched on a few times that's really important in that area is, the idea of authenticity, which is there's a I think that we're really lucky to have this book, particularly as we go into this time, and I think we're really lucky that we had you to write it, because when we talk about things like capitalism and we talk about American society and the things that it does and that it can do, one of the things that we know it can do is it can commodify anything. And
Yes.
so like anything can be packaged, anything can be sold, and anything can be, turned into an identity, which you can then use to package and sell more
Yes.
things. And
Yes.
so there's a way that this concept of joy could have been approached.
Yeah.
As you said, I can write some very nice words about joy, make you feel joyful while you're reading a book, and then that's it. But the way that you've approached it, I think, is so built around this core of authenticity, which I think fundamentally just goes to a sense of honesty, and not just you know being honest, outwards in the things that you say, but you're really just being honest with yourself and being able to say, you know, I don't wake up every day joyful. Sometimes I wake up every day and something's going wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe something went wrong yesterday. Maybe I was fine until I woke up and then I saw something went wrong today.
Right.
And I lost that space. And we we talk about joy as a choice, and I think, and to some extent, every choice is a responsibility. But what we don't want to do is make joy a responsibility in the sense that people feel like they have to carry it all the time, or they're not doing it right.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Um, and I think that's been a really great part of your work is, as you said, with a couple of other things, not really necessarily making the distinction between joy and a non-joyful reality. That it's not. One of the things that's interesting about joy, as you put it, is that it's not an escape. We
Yes.
talk a lot about escapism these days and things like that, but joy is not an escape.
Right.
It's deeply intertwined with everything else that goes on in the world.
I think it can be.
Mm.
I think it can be. I just, to your point, because you said it really well, in the commodification, that's where it gets dangerous. Of like, then joy becomes this escapism, which is denying the reality, which I think then it creates this vapidness around. There's not, the depth is not there then for the joy if it's not in reality of what's actually happening, as opposed to like, I'm gonna run to the corner to feel joy, as
Right.
opposed to joy happens in the face of these things, not away from it.
Right.
That makes
So it's just like you said, exactly, in terms of like it not being performance. So like joy is not what I perform on Instagram.
Right.
It's something
sense.
that
Right.
and so like talking about that in these the relationship between an authentic joy and what we're seeing a lot now in terms of people being sort of enticed into virtual realities, or being told that we're kind of being led to believe now that like algorithms can like make our choices, do our jobs, and tell our stories way better than we can.
Yeah.
And that even we're being told like, well, you're more likely to be happy, you can find that happiness in the virtual world that you're never going to find in the real world, because in the real world it doesn't exist.
Very true.
So in your opinion though, can an algorithm choose joy for us if we're simply letting the algorithm make our decisions, and can we find real joy in a virtual reality?
That's so interesting. Honestly, I'm still very nascent in that world of things. My thought, though, from my limited understanding around AI and all these different things, is it's taught by humans. So I'd be curious to know how many black folks are teaching these technologies about joy for it to be able to generate it in that way. And let's say they did, how would we experience that? I wonder. Like, could we recognize a black joyful story that, because I think we could. I think right now you could type in things like that, and the thing will try to piece it together.
Mhm.
But if I'm hearing your question is like, but is that authentic, or what
Yeah.
would we define that as such? I'm hesitant to say yes or no because I really don't know. In terms of the virtual space, yes, because that's something that I experienced in the early part of the pandemic, like 2020, 2021, that there was one of them was from this amazing artist, activist, musician, Jewel Cadet, activist, who she made these really incredible spaces on Zoom that I didn't know were possible. That were very, and they centered Black queer folks, Black non-binary folks, Black trans folks in a particular way that honestly it was like one of a handful of experiences I've had that it didn't feel like I was on a computer. And this was like a more than an hour of experience with her, and the other people. The way that it was just set up was just really brilliant. That it showed me, yes, you can cultivate something like this in a virtual space.
Hmm.
And there was another time, oh, Akuya, who I mentioned earlier, she does these things called unreasonable action marathons. Unreasonable is important to underline because she sets up a Zoom that is from like 10 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Oh,
Oh
wow.
wow.
But it's like these, it's a marathon, so it's like these stints for 45 minutes. It depends. I don't want to mess up the setup, but the idea is that it's like she's facilitating this marathon of action, so that by the end of it, you have really made a leap forward on something that you want to work on. But what I'm bringing up is that it didn't feel like I was on Zoom all day. That Akuya was able to like bring a group of mostly black folks together for an entire day on Zoom, and it didn't feel like that. That
Wow.
was like, whoa. What I actually remember was the labs and like really insightful things being shared and things like that. That
Yeah.
it's just the level of intentionality that is necessary in virtual, which is true in any space, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we just assume it's easier on the internet.
Mhm.
That I think it's just about intention. But yes, I think there's definitely space virtually to that Black joy shows up authentically and cultivated. Um, I just don't think it's very frequent, or I haven't experienced it frequently in the deep way. I think yes, I'd be scrolling like everybody else, and I have other.
Mhm.
So I'm not gonna be fake about that. But I mean like those deeper, like wow, that was because that thing I talked about only went once, like 4 years ago on a Zoom, and I still remember it very clearly. When
Mhm.
I've had plenty of Zoom calls since then, I remember none of them.
Yeah.
That you know what I mean? So I
Yeah.
think that that is possible, and it's totally. And if I dare may say, it does require a level of exclusivity. I don't think that our spaces that cultivate Black joy always have to be for everybody. I think that some things get to be ours, and that's the sacredness of it being ours, and that the sacredness around our joy is because it's a generative thing. Like that's one of the elements that gives us life to do the other things. That
Yeah.
is sacred. That is something we get to protect and preserve, and cultivate amongst us because it only comes from us anyways. So why it doesn't all have to be, like yeah, just something around that. Like that's one of those spaces that gets to be ours unapologetically, and we don't have to explain why this is a black space, so to speak, for lack of a better term.
And I love
Mhm.
also that
Yeah.
you talked about like the creativity and innovation of the things that your friends were doing that you got involved with. And I think that it's almost like that there was like when lockdown happened, I know lockdown was really hard for people, but I also have seen a lot of people who created some amazing
Yeah. Yes.
things during lockdown that like
Mhm.
created organizations, new virtual ways of connection. And it was like, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe it was like 2 years in, it just all sort of like was gone. And I do
Fatigue.
think we need to find a way to get back to that creativity. It's like, oh no, we can be in the world, but we can also be creative and be innovative and find deeper, ways of connection. I mean, that was one of the reasons when we decided to do this series. We actually decided no chat and no little all those bubbles and whatever hearts, and was like, no, we just want you to take an hour, 2 hours, and you just sit and be a part of a conversation.
Yeah.
And that's something that we hardly get anymore because there's so much this requirement of
Repeat.
interactivity.
Yeah.
But what is it like just to like watch something and you're not interacting, you're actually just listening? And so I do think that we need to, I hope there is a way to help people get back to that thing. It was like a spark that was
Yeah.
happening for a lot of people. They became alive in a very different way.
Yeah.
And I think that we've lost it, and it's almost like, can we get people to tap back into that, because it really does require a lot of authenticity and sitting with oneself and then creating something just because, not
Yeah.
because you're trying to sell it, not
Right.
because, you're trying, whatever, you're trying to get like a lot of attention for it, but just because it's something that you feel compelled to do, and you're working to connect with others who have that same desire for connection.
I think so too. Shameless plug to the book. It just made me think about the beauty of the not the beauty, but the intention of the art, right? That to have that type of pause of like a moment where it's not a screen, unless you're on an e-reader. But even still, that's a different experience from having the physical book. That was part of it, was to, let's say you don't love reading, which is okay. There's a whole other conversation, and you have access to through these visuals, right? That are across it's all almost every kind of media, whether it's digital collages, analog collages, paintings, photographs. The subjects, the range is from like nature to elder folks, babies, pregnant folks. Like it's just very, the range is big, and the idea of what I thought I was hearing you say, Janine, around just that presence of like just being in a moment for a second, of like just to absorb it in that way, or even to just even I was gonna say the word escape, that for a second to like be there and let that evoke whatever it needs to, because there's one that comes up a lot in there, that it's a grandmother's hands like splitting peas or something, and there's been tons of people that are like, that's my grandma's hands, like that type of thing, that it's for that of like, you don't even, it's a painting first of all, so it's not even, it might not even be a real person's set of hands, but that's enough to like evoke that. And what happened then, what can you do with that once you're put in that space? I think you have more capacity to do things, as opposed to what Brian was naming much earlier, of when we're in survival mode, how that literally affects you, of like shorter breaths, you're anxious more, you don't have the capacity to think ahead as much. You're very reactionary, it's immediate, you're the state of mind that you're in, that hopefully when you get to flip through these pages, even if you're not reading it right away, is to give that breath, like to be able to take a breath, a pause, because you deserve that. We always have that, if nothing else, is to take a second. Yeah, that's part of the intention.
Yeah, it is a beautiful book to pause with, and
Yes.
we definitely are happy to have it for sale in the AphroChic shop, so
Hmm.
people can head over there and buy a copy through our partnership with bookshop.org that supports independent booksellers. I think this is actually just a wonderful gift, and like you said, you actually have put in here so many ways for people to interact with joy from different senses. You're reading, but you're also, the visuals are there too. And I'm an interior designer, so I love a really good cover. And the cover is one of those that has all these colors in it that I always call smile inducing colors. Like you look at these
Mm.
colors and you're going to smile. You can't help yourself. And you want to grab this and you want to look at it. So I definitely think this is something that people should look at for, the holiday season. Get this book, gift this book.
Thank you.
It really is a very special book that is nonfiction but art, and it entices you to think, and like you call it there, it's this a love letter
Yeah.
uh,
Yes.
to Black people in the most beautiful way.
Yeah.
And if I
No.
could just shout out real quick, because they really deserve it, is all the artists. There's 53 artists that are part of this project that range geographically from as far as Australia to different parts of the continent and beyond. That they are amazing. Most of those people we've never met physically in person. They've trusted me through digital and virtual interactions for the last 3 years, to share their very precious art with the world, not just with me. That they're just amazing. So part of the intention also was for people to stop and look them up. I'm a nerd, so I do that. So I,
Mhm.
hopefully other people do that. Is that when something excites you in a book, is that you pause and like, I want to know more about this right now. That I hope it ripples in that way of people being exposed to there's Black artists. I mean, we know this, but now you literally have examples of Black artists that are from all these different parts of the world, and to see like some of the ways that it's laid out, that it looks like they might even know each other. The ways that they were framed or composed, and it's two totally different artists. And that there's three pieces written by that were commissioned by other writers as well. One of them, Letohongo Nolo, is a South African who lives in Johannesburg, and their essay about Black queer joy in the South African context. And they're a podcast, also a literary podcast. So it's interesting because they work in the law, as a professional, but also in the literary space of promoting Black African writers, and so offering that perspective. And then there's Munganyende, who is a star, and she is of Rwandan heritage, and she moved to the Netherlands in the 90s after the genocide in Rwanda. And her experience, she wrote an essay about her experience migrating. Uh, I, I'm not going to use that word because she's careful not to use that word, but moving from Rwanda to Europe, and what does that mean for a dark-skinned African woman to move to Europe, and what are her experiences both there and traveling through parts of Africa? And then the last one is Sister Zai, who is a Zimbabwean woman who had been living in Australia for 10 years. And so she's a poet, and she wrote a really powerful poem about what is her role or responsibility or relationship as a Black African woman to the Black Indigenous people of Australia. And the idea is, just to give a little bit of something for any kind of person that if you just want to read a poem, it's in there. If you
Yes.
want to read a short essay, it's in there. If you want to read in-depth chapters, they're there. If you only want to look at the art, like my grandma loves art and stuff, so she'd be flipping through that book, and she's in there. So of course you got to go make sure she
Yes.
sees stuff. That yeah, there's a little bit of everyone. To go back to what I said much earlier, is that part of the core of the Black Joy Project is always to offer as many ways to enter this as possible. That we acknowledge that as many millions, billions of Black people that exist in the world, there's that many ways to potentially enter it, and that the aspiration is to offer that many. But in this case, in the ways that we could, is to offer that it should feel like that there isn't a way to be Black, that there's
Yes.
multiple ways to be Black, and that this book is trying to reflect in the form that too.
And I think it
Beautiful.
definitely offers that in terms of like it's composite as it
Yeah.
all comes together because within the book has a fantastic number of layers to it.
Yeah.
It has personal stories and anecdotes. It has episodes of people from history. It has perspectives and just sort of examples of joy coming from different cultures from all over the diaspora, from the
Yes.
continent to the Caribbean and everywhere in between. And because of that, it does give you that sense of the expansiveness, which is I think one of the most important things is that it explores Black joy without limiting it in any way.
Yes.
And so I
Yes.
think that was another really fantastic achievement that
Thank
this
you.
was able to do. And so, sort of as we prepare now to depart this conversation, we
Yeah.
recognize that. So one of the last challenges we'll talk about, one of the challenges of joy can be finding it, but another one of the challenges of joy can be keeping it.
Yes.
So now is where getting ready to move on from this conversation, and we have one last question to ask.
Sure.
This architect of the Black Joy Project. It's what should we plan to do with the joy we found tonight,
Mm.
and how do we protect it tomorrow, both for ourselves and for each other?
Well, the first thing that came to mind you're doing is recording it.
Mhm.
Have a record of the joy as a way to remember it. Um, yeah, I think one of them is having records, like something that can remind us of the thing, which is part of why in the book there's archival images too. It's not all just contemporary art, but I thought it was important to see like Black kids in the 30s playing games, or like women in the military putting puzzles together. You never put
Remember
those
that?
two,
Yeah.
that yeah, part of it is like the principle of Sankofa, right? That to
Mhm.
look back, to be able to move forward and understand the present, that feels inherent to Blackness. Is there's always that tension, like we were saying earlier, of time not being a linear thing. Um, that yeah, something is what in your question was making me think about a lot. Record it so that we can come back to it, but also as a way to launch from it too, like to jump off of it. Um,
I love the idea of archiving, like you
Yeah.
said.
We think that's one of the most important things we have, especially we've noticed sort of recently, even in our own just sort of like streaming experience, where a lot of Black shows that we've either were halfway through watching or were looking forward to watching have suddenly just vanished. They
right?
can't be
You
found
were like,
anywhere.
what? Where
Some
did
of
that
them you have
goes?
to pay for now, and some of them they're just like completely gone. Like you can't find, they're not on DVD. Nobody recorded them.
No,
They're
it's true. That's
gone.
true.
Yeah, so
So
creating that record. But yes, thank you so much,
yes,
Cleaver,
thank you.
for joining us tonight. This was such an important conversation, a beautiful book.
Thank you.
And the Black Joy Project in general. I know people can go to the website as well to learn more about the Black Joy Project.
Yes.
Um,
Oh yeah, if you visit blackjoy.org, it takes you to a resource guide where there's a playlist, there's other book recommendations, films, businesses, a ton of things on there, and of course a link to where to buy it.
Yes, yes, yes. So definitely all visit
And
blackjoy.org.
yes, yes.
Yes, also. So yes, again, thank you, Kleaver, for a really fantastic conversation. It's fun talking to you because everything you say brings up at least 6 other questions that can all like come back together, and so I know we could do this for longer, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do it again. But
Yeah,
thank you, and
thank you.
thank you to everyone for spending time with us tonight. We definitely want to keep the conversation going, so please stay in conversation. Definitely visit blackjoyproject.org and visit us also at AphroChic.com, where you can watch this and other past episodes of An Evening With. You can check out our magazine, issue 18 just dropped. So, please come check out issue 18. You're going to see our podcast, and also subscribe to our newsletter for more information about upcoming events and things will be going on in the world of AphroChic. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you. Good night.